You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome to Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan. In the last 4 years, partisan politics have reached a new low in our nation. Everyone deplores this, but the American people made their preference quite clear in the last presidential election, with a landslide vote for Biden and the Democrats against Trump and his party, whatever that party is, the Republican Party or some nightmare of a Trumpist party. Agonies within the Republican Party become more evident every day. Is it time for a new party? A third party? The revamping of the GOP? For that matter, united as they seem sometimes to be, the Democrats also have internal fault lines, progressives versus conservatives, within their fold. Of course, some of these changes have been coming for a very long time. I'd say since Newt Gingrich and his so-called Contract with America legislative agenda in the congressional midterm election in 1994, halfway through Bill Clinton's 2 terms. In any event, now, post-Trump, it's unfair to say the Republican Party has no standards. They do. They have double standards. Certainly their base, comprised in no small part of the religious right, is maniacally set on believing election fraud, accustomed as they already are to believing in divinity with no proof. Our elections have now become anxiety-provoking events, while the Russians congratulate themselves on being able to vote in American elections, which they find very pleasant, since they're unable to vote in their own. All of which is simply to say that it's time we looked very closely at the political parties, and that's what we're going to do in today's program. So we better start by going inside the headlines. American politics has been dominated by 2 major political parties since soon after the founding of our republic. Since the 1850s, the Democratic Party, center-left and liberal, and the Republican Party, center-right and conservative, have formed this 2-party system with considerable variations over time. Third parties do operate in the United States and sometimes elect candidates to local offices, but have never made inroads per se nationally. The largest since the 1980s has been the Libertarian Party, founded in 1972 and bent on reducing size, influence, and expenditures in all levels of government. But the Libertarians, the left-wing Green Party, the Conservative Constitution Party, and other smaller parties receive minimal support and appear on the ballot in only some states. Most political scientists and historians divide the development of our 2-party system into 5 eras. The first system consisted of the Federalist Party, which supported the Constitution's ratification, and the Anti-Federalists, sometimes called the Democratic Republican Party or Jeffersonian Republicans, who opposed the powerful central government that the Constitution established when it took effect in 1789. The Federalists had grown from a network begun by George Washington's Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, pushing for a strong united central government, close ties with Britain, a centralized banking system, and links between the government and men of wealth. Although James Madison wrote the Federalist Papers together with Hamilton, and although he inveighed against political parties, Madison also co-founded the Democratic Republican Party with Jefferson, who strongly opposed Hamilton and his agenda. The Jeffersonians came to power in 1800, and the Federalists managed to survive in the Northeast, but their elitist refusal to support the War of 1812 verged on secession, and suffered hugely when that war ended well. The second party system, 1828 to 1854, followed the splintering of the Democratic-Republican Party. Two major parties were left to dominate the landscape. The Whig Party, led by Henry Clay, that grew from the National Republican Party, and advocated the primacy of Congress over the executive branch, as well as policies of modernization and of economic protectionism. The early 1850s saw the collapse of the Whigs, largely as a result of a major intra-party split over slavery, resulting from the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Democratic Party, led by Andrew Jackson, supported the primacy of the presidency over other branches of government, and opposed both the Bank of the United States as well as modernizing programs that they feared would build up industry at the expense of farmers and an agricultural, then, nation. The third party system, roughly 1854 to the mid-1890s, was characterized by the emergence of anti-slavery Republicans and adopted many of the economic policies of the Whigs, such as national banks, railroads, high tariffs, homesteads, and aid to land-grant colleges. Civil War and Reconstruction issues polarized the parties until the infamous Compromise of 1877, which ended the progress of Reconstruction. Both parties then became broad-based voting coalitions, with the race issue pulling newly enfranchised African-American men, called freedmen, into the Republican Party, while white Southern men, called redeemers, joined the Democrats. The Democratic coalition also had Catholic immigrants and pro-business conservative, quote, copperheads, close quote. The Republican coalition had businessmen, shop owners, skilled craftsmen, clerks, and professionals. The fourth party system, 1896 to approximately 1932, saw major shifts in the central issues of debate and corresponded with the progressive era dominated by Republicans. It began after the Republicans blamed the Democrats for the Panic of 1893, which later resulted in William McKinley's victory over William Jennings Bryan in the 1896 presidential election. Domestic issues included government regulation of railroads and large corporations, the protective tariff, the role of labor unions, child labor, the need for a new banking system, primary elections, women's suffrage, and control of immigration. The fifth party system emerged with Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal coalition beginning in 1933, as parties separated themselves out into more specific liberal versus conservative positions. Liberal opposition Republicans, such as Nelson Rockefeller and Jacob Javits, gained major attention but lost influence steadily after 1964. In the sixth party system, 1968 to the present, we saw the end of a historical alignment. The so-called Southern strategy shifted Southern Democrats to the Republican Party, as Nixon was winning landslides. Ideologies diverged further apart with new voter coalitions, including the emergence of the religious right, and with Southern whites voting for Republican candidates in the 1950s. Under Lyndon Johnson and his Great Society plan, the Democratic Party slowly lost dominance in Southern states until 1966. Generally, Democrats tend to be strongest in the Northeast and the West Coast and in major American urban centers. Trade unions, African Americans, and Latinos are disproportionately Democratic, and in 2004 it was the largest political party with 72 million registered voters out of 169 million claiming affiliation. The framers of the Constitution intentionally omitted mention of political parties from the founding document because they desperately wanted to avoid the divisions that had torn England apart in the civil wars of the 17th century. And many of them saw parties, or factions as they called them, as corrupt relics of the monarchical British system. George Washington's family had fled England precisely to avoid the civil wars, so it's not surprising that he said, quote, "However political parties may now and then answer popular ends, they are likely to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government." Period, close quote. Alexander Hamilton called political parties, quote, "the most fatal disease of popular governments," and also said, quote, "We are attempting by this Constitution to abolish them," period, close quote. James Madison wrote that, quote, "one of the functions of a well-constructed union should be its tendency to break and control the violence of factions," close quote. But Jefferson, who had been serving a diplomatic post in France during the Constitutional Convention, thought it was a mistake not to provide for different political parties. Washington ran unopposed to win the first presidential election and chose his cabinet to be inclusive of differing political viewpoints, Jefferson as Secretary of State, Hamilton as Treasury Secretary, two competing visions for America. Although Madison sided with Hamilton in the defense of the Constitution, he strongly opposed Hamilton's ambitious financial programs, which he saw as concentrating too much power in the hands of the federal government. So, in 1791, Madison and Jefferson joined forces to form what would become the Democratic-Republican Party, forerunner of today's Democratic Party. By the mid-1790s, Jefferson and Hamilton had both quit Washington's cabinet, while the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists spent much of Washington's second term viciously attacking each other in competing newspapers. Some historians say Washington stayed for a second term only to keep these two parties from warring with each other, afraid that the Union itself would shatter. But by then the damage had been done. After the fractious 1796 election, when John Adams narrowly defeated Jefferson, Adams, who also said, quote, "There is nothing which I dread so much as a division of the Republic into two great parties. This is to be dreaded as the greatest political evil under our Constitution," close quote. Adams nonetheless moved to crush opposition by making it a federal crime to criticize the president or his administration. Jefferson retorted by toppling the unpopular Adams 4 years later, when Democratic Republicans won both Congress and the presidency. Then Jefferson fired the top half of all federal employees, keeping only clerks and customs agents, destroying the Federalist Party beyond all possibility of rebuilding. But the two-party system revived itself with Andrew Jackson's Democratic Party and solidified in the 1850s after the founding of the Republican Party. The two-party system we know now had locked into place by 1860 on the brink of civil war and has remained in place to this very day. We have to take a short break here, but we will return in just a moment with what else? The Surrealism Corner. Subscribe to this program on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review. Follow us on Twitter at WMC Live, like our Facebook page at facebook.com/WMC Live, and visit us at WMCLive.com for more information about our show and our guests.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
If we're discussing political parties, We absolutely must be in the surrealism corner. Political parties have proliferated in this country to the point of being humorous. There was the Surprise Party, launched by Stephen Colbert, the United States Pirate Party to prevent online censorship, the American Vegetarian Party, which came after meat shortages from World War II, and the Boston Tea Party, no, not that one, in favor of worldwide military withdrawal, legalization of marijuana, and ending legalized government surveillance. There was also, of course, the Green Party, founded in 1991 and operating in local elections in 36 states and Washington, D.C. The Libertarian Party is represented in 48 states and Washington, D.C. In opposition to the conservatism in the Republican Party, Theodore Roosevelt started the much more progressive Bull Moose Party, but after a defeat, that party dissolved and joined back up with the Republicans. And there's the Socialist Party, and there's even the tiny, minuscule Communist Party. Immigration goes back to the Republic's beginning, but so does anti-immigrant bigotry. In 1840, the Know-Nothing Party came out of nativist fears about immigrants from Germany, Ireland, and especially China, flooding into America. But party members, wary of gaining attention, would shrug and claim, "I know nothing," when asked about the party's existence. The Anti-Masonic Party was founded by conspiracy theorists in 1828 to expose and dismantle the Freemason Society across America. It was the first political organization to publish a platform and hold nominating conventions, but it failed in its mission and disbanded in 1840. The Free Soil Party, founded in 1848, advocated the prohibition of slavery in America's southwestern territories. It managed to nominate former President Martin Van Buren for the presidency in 1848, but wound up tipping the vote in Zachary Taylor's favor, ensuring his election as America's 12th president. And it disbanded in 1854. And there also was the Readjuster Party. Formed for the sole purpose of reducing Virginia's post-Civil War debt in order to maintain its solvency. It disbanded after losing every seat statewide and nationally. The Silver Party was born when miners struck silver at the Comstock Lode in Nevada. The mineral became a cornerstone of economics in the state, but the party fizzled nationally. They couldn't make that the national standard for currency, and it was disbanded in 1912. The Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Party worked, not surprisingly, to enfranchise women. The States' Rights Democratic Party was known colloquially as the Dixiecrats and became notorious for nominating arch segregationist Strom Thurmond for president. He would garner 39 electoral college votes. The party was subsequently squashed by the Democratic Party and never reemerged, at least not openly. There are more, but so much for the minor players. According to the Pew Research Center, independents outnumber either Republicans or Democrats. In 2014, 39% of the public identified as independent, 32% as Democrat, and 23% as Republican. However, that reflects the fact that people lean toward one of the main parties, but don't fully support everything the party stands for. And to wind up our Surrealism Corner visit, did you know that the Republican Party got their elephant logo from a political cartoon by Thomas Nast in Harper's Weekly? Did you know that when Andrew Jackson's opponents called him a jackass, he embraced the insult and put a donkey on his campaign posters, and Democrats have used it as their symbol ever since? And did you know that a convict, Eugene V. Debs, 5-time Socialist Party candidate who ran for president in the early 1900s, did so from prison. Yes, during the First World War, Debs publicly protested the war and the military draft and was jailed in 1918 for agitation against the government. 2 years later, he made his fifth and final run, this time from a federal prison. He did lose, but nevertheless he received over 900,000 votes. And did you know that given women's limited voting rights in the late 19th and early 20th century in the territories and the states, the authorities were concerned that women would have our say on issues we weren't legally entitled to vote for. So, the government created 2 separate ballot boxes, one for men and one for women. That way, if any so-called illegal ballots were to show up in the women's box, they could easily be thrown out. Possibly the first form of voter suppression. Surreal. Time for our last break, but I'll return directly with some fighting words. The Women's Media Center, founded in 2005 by Jane Fonda, Gloria Steinem, and myself, is a progressive, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to make women visible and powerful in media. You can learn more about the WMC at womensmediacenter.com.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Political parties. Those can be fighting words. We learn about the two-party system in school. We think of it as a given. The 2 ruling parties have institutionalized themselves in our political system. Campaign finance laws are skewed in their favor. They get preferential ballot access. Congressional leaders and members get legislative committee assignments. Executive branch appointments usually follow party lines. What's more, taxpayers foot the bill for primary elections, notwithstanding the fact that legally, parties are private associations. All this despite the fact that virtually all of the framers of the Constitution were opposed to parties, or factions, as they termed them. Only Jefferson, returning from serving in France during the Constitutional Convention, came back without a clear record of his convictions. On the one hand, he claimed that if he were unable to go to heaven unless as a member of a political party, he would eschew going to heaven. But on the other, he managed to create and lead a political party while insisting parties were evil agents. Jefferson lived quite comfortably with lots of contradictions, you know. He and James Madison together forged the very first opposition party in the United States, an audacious act that, in effect, invented a modern form of political behavior before any neutral vocabulary existed for discussing it. This was an alliance that John Quincy Adams would later describe thus, quote, "The mutual influence of these 2 mighty minds on each other is a phenomenon like the invisible and mysterious movements of the magnet in the physical world." Close quote. Jefferson and Madison were labeled traitors by the Federalist press. Jefferson was called a pagan and an atheist, a treasonable conspirator against the duly elected administrations of Washington and Adams, a utopian, an anarchist, and a behind-the-scenes manipulator of Republican propaganda. Jefferson's major focus, however, was less on defining the powers of government than on the absence of any Bill of Rights. That is, in identifying areas where government could not intrude. He did not think primarily in constitutional categories, but Madison did. And so the precarious balance wherein the individual rights that so preoccupied Jefferson and the new nation's needs that motivated Madison came about. Individual rights versus the good of the whole. Our history shows repeated events in which the populace has tried to expand parties, combine them, or split them to seize back control of the republic. The origins of primary elections, or primaries, for example, can be traced to the progressive movement of the 20th century and earlier in the United States, which aimed to take the power of candidate nomination from party leaders to the people. Sounds like a good idea, yeah? Most other countries rely on party leaders or on paid-up party members to select candidates, as was previously the case here. There are generally two types of primaries: closed primaries, or internal or party primaries, in which only party members can vote, and open primaries, in which all voters can take part and may cast votes on a ballot of any party. But wait, political parties still control the method of nomination of candidates for office in the name of the party. Aha! Other methods of selecting candidates include caucuses, conventions, nomination meetings, etc. A United States presidential nominating convention is a political convention held every 4 years by most of the parties who will be fielding nominees in the upcoming presidential election. The formal purpose of such a convention is to select the party's nominee for election as president, as well as to adopt a statement of party principles and goals known as the party platform, which basically everybody ignores thereafter, and to adopt the rules for the party's activities, including the presidential nominating process for the next election cycle. But since 1972, the delegates have been mostly selected in presidential primaries, state by state. So, in actuality, the nominees have already been decided well before conventions begin, and the conventions themselves wind up being garish, somewhat inebriated displays of self-congratulatory patriotism, ego-flaunting speeches bombastically delivered by minor politicians, and the ghastly wearing of bedecked hats, shirts, buttons, and other party insignia. Sometimes I think that when George Washington, in his farewell address, wrote, "Let me now warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party," he wasn't referring to factional nastiness at all, but rather had in mind the wearing apparel and behavior of delegates to national political conventions. Defenders of political parties note that their main job is to help voters understand the basic beliefs of a candidate and to streamline the voting process for voters. They note that political parties also provide support activities for candidates, that parties hold fundraisers, distribute literature and money, and encourage people to register to vote. Near election time, they perform polls and make phone calls to get out the vote. And, of course, they advertise. Because of our piteously weak campaign finance laws, only advertising companies make gazillions of dollars off elections. Defenders also claim that political parties help keep our country from splitting into multiple parties, which would be detrimental to running the government efficiently. Opposers of the two-party system, like Lee Drutman, wrote last year in The Atlantic that the framers thought they were using the most advanced political theory of the day to prevent parties from forming. By separating powers across competing institutions or branches, they thought a majority party would never come together. Furthermore, Madison supported the idea of an extended republic, a strong national government as opposed to 13 loosely confederated states. He reasoned that in a small republic, factions could more easily unite into consistent governing majorities, but in a large republic, with more factions and more distance, a permanent majority and a permanent minority was less likely. Or so it was thought. But, according to the opposers, modern mass democracy requires parties, and partisanship has become a strong identity that can jump across institutions and branches and eventually collapse the republic's diversity into just two camps. Drutman notes that, quote, for much of American political history, the critique of the two-party system was not that the parties were too far apart. It was that they were too similar, and they stood for too little. But this was before American politics became fully nationalized, close quote. Drutman also argues that the framers could not have known that plurality elections, that's whoever gets the most votes wins, tend to generate just two parties, while proportional elections, vote shares in multi-winner districts translate into seat shares, tend to generate multiple parties. The only electoral system in operation then was the 1430 innovation of plurality voting, which the framers imported from Britain without debate. Currently, the nationalization of politics, due to partisan geographical cultural splits and consistently close elections, have reinforced one another, pulling both parties into top-down leadership, enforcing party discipline, brand loyalty, and destroying cross-party deal-making, which cracks the system of separation of powers and of checks and balances that the framers created. Had the framers accepted the historical inevitability of political parties, they might well have tried to institutionalize multi-party democracy and proportional representation. But meanwhile, there's a whole other third force, the independents. According to polling, citizens are disavowing party affiliation in droves. In 1950, almost 85% of voters identified with one of the two major parties. Today, barely half the country identifies with either one of the parties, and the trend has accelerated. Currently, independent voters cannot vote in some primaries, which is a real problem. But the independent vote is approaching that of being greater than the Democratic or Republican votes. So far, it's a swing vote, and in the 2020 elections, it swung strongly toward Biden. That, and the emergence of a stronger-than-ever gender gap, plus the shift in demographics toward black and brown voters in the South and in the Southwest, presages changes in the two-party system that are difficult to wrangle at this point or to imagine. Entrenched party resistance would be a formidable adversary, and the sheer power of inertia whispers to me that we will stay with what we have for as long as possible, if for no other reason than pure sloth. But one can never be certain. The only thing we can be sure of is that things will change. Those are my fighting words. Add yours on Twitter, and remember to tag us at WMC Live and use the hashtag Fighting Words. And that's our show for this week. You can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and now Instagram at The Robin Morgan, and you can check out my blog at robinmorgan.net and find my latest book of poems, Dark Matter, and my brand new novel, Parallax, wherever books are sold. Opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily represent the Women's Media Center. Here's the family for Women's Media Center Live. Executive producer as well as founding and sustaining sponsor, Regina K. Scully. WMC president and co-executive producer of this program, Julie Burton. I'm Robin Morgan, your producer and host. Thank you for being with us. Join us again next time on Women's Media Center Live.